Good evening and welcome to the 2022 Walton Lecture on Science and Religion. My name is Peter van der Burgt and I'm chairing the Committee of Christians in Science Ireland, which is organizing the Walton Lectures. We are a local group of Christians in science based in the United Kingdom and Ireland. On your screen beside me is Dr. Miriam Schilling, who will give the 2022 Walton Lecture shortly. Before I introduce Dr. Schilling, I want to say a few words about the Walton Lectures. These lectures are named after Ernest Walton, who was Professor of Physics at Trinity College Dublin. Ernest Walton shared the 1951 Nobel Prize in Physics with John Grofton for the nuclear physics experiments they did at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University. Walton was a long-time member of the Methodist Church, and following the award of the Nobel Prize, he spoke on science and religion in various locations. At this point, we want to acknowledge Marion and Derek Woods in Belfast. Marion is Walton's daughter, and on behalf of the Walton family, she has agreed that we could use Walton's name for these lectures. We're excited that Dr. Schilling has agreed to give the 2022 Walton Lecture on the topic of viruses. For the last 2.5 years, the coronavirus pandemic has disrupted most of our normal activities and has led to an enormous amount of suffering. As Christians, we might wonder whether the existence of viruses was originally intended by God or what this tells us about his character. We're looking forward to the insights that Dr. Schilling will be able to give us about the biology of viruses and the links with many of the bigger questions in life. Miriam Schilling obtained a PhD degree in virology at the University of Freiburg in Germany in 2016. After 5 years as a postdoc at the University of Oxford, she now works for the Animal and Plant Health Agency and studies viruses that are transmitted by mosquitoes. In her free time, she has been studying theology part-time in Stuttgart, Freiburg, and Oxford, and she's currently working on a Doctor of Philosophy degree with Professor Alistair McGrath, in which she explores the theological aspects of viruses. She has written a book in German about her investigations, Warum erschuf Gott die Viren? Mit einer Virologie auf Entdeckungsreise. The title of Dr. Schilling's lecture tonight is Why Are There Viruses in God's Creation?
Thank you so much for this very nice introduction and for inviting me for this evening's talk. I'm quite excited to explore some of these topics with you tonight. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and then I can discuss them with you later after my talk. So why are there viruses in God's creation? I think it comes to no surprise that lots of people asked this question in the last 3 years. The coronavirus pandemic has come as a shock to most of us. I think even virologists were quite surprised how quite unfortunate features of this virus led to an immense spread, a quick spread, and to the suffering that we've witnessed. But coronavirus is not the only virus we've recently experienced. I assume you're aware that there's currently an Ebola outbreak in Uganda ongoing, and it's still not under control, so we're expecting a lot more deaths in the next couple of months there as well. We've seen monkeypox rise, and we've seen the consequences of that disease. Fortunately, there is the option of vaccination to prevent spread, and it's of course much easier than with coronavirus to actually isolate patients. And the third virus we've recently encountered and we're still experiencing is the avian influenza virus outbreak, and the outbreak is to an extent that's unprecedented. So we're having more dead animals than we've ever had in the whole of Europe. So there's lots of viruses still around spreading that we currently can read up on the news. And of course, as Christians, we wonder when we read Genesis 1, and God says that he saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Can we believe that? Or was there something that changed the goodness of what God originally intended, and now that's the mess we see? So how do we fit viruses into this whole story? Did God know about viruses beforehand? Did he create them? So these are questions not only we ask, but probably lots of people ask around the globe if they're religious or not. The first question I will raise is what we're seeing simply a subjective experience? So were we just born in the wrong decade? Is that something that's unique for us, that we see these viruses? And I assume you know the answer is no. So if you look at this map between 1998 and 2019, so everything that happened before the pandemic, you can see in green a lot of newly identified emerging infections, and in red you can see disease spreading to new areas, and in blue you can see emerging infections and disease spread. And you can read the names, hopefully. There's West Nile and avian influenza, there's monkeypox already, there's Zika virus and SARS coronavirus as well. And all of these things, what they have in common is that in most cases, these are zoonotic diseases. So in about 60% or 75% of all these cases, they've come from the animal kingdom and what we feel like intruded our kingdom. So this is, of course, not a unique experience. This is constantly ongoing, that we see viruses spread from the animal kingdom into our world. Can we put a number on the suffering? I mean, with coronavirus, we've all had personal experiences and we've seen the world crumble a bit. But economists have looked at this phenomenon for a long time. And of course, they can measure costs within the health sector, but they can also measure the costs in several other sectors of public life, including tourism industry and trade. And the interesting thing is that even very small virus outbreaks can cause measurably large amounts of suffering, because what they assume is that the economic loss basically equals or can be used as an indicator for the amount of fear or impacts on mental health, because that fear will spread. And so you can have a very tiny outbreak of whatever virus in the middle of Africa, and it still affects the US economy. It still affects our economy over here. So this is quite interesting and basically shows what we've all known. This is probably not a subjective experience in that sense. Viruses can cause dramatic amounts of suffering. Do we have any idea how big the threat is? So one question one might ask is, how many viruses are there actually? How often will we have to encounter these things? The answer is we don't know. There's some estimations. Here's one example. So there's a paper published in 2013. And what they have done is they've collected samples from an Indian flying fox, less than 2,000 samples, as you can see. And they found 58 different viruses in these samples. The interesting bit is that 55 of those were newly identified, so we had never seen them before. That's a large amount of viruses in contrast to the ones that we have known before. So what do we do with that knowledge? So this is one species. Let's assume this ratio is roughly true for all species. Then we know that we have about 5,400 known mammalian species, which would mean that there must be around 320,000 unknown viruses that can infect mammals around. Potentially more. We know there are about 62,000 vertebrate species. That would make about 3 million viruses that we've never seen before. And there are about 1.7 million known species that include all sorts of things, plants, mushrooms, algae, and that would make about 100 million viruses that we haven't even characterized yet. And to make this whole thing worse, this is probably an underestimation, because this research group only looked at 9 viral families, and this does not include viruses of bacteria, archaea, and any other single-cell organism. So there's a ton of viruses that we have no clue exist and that we haven't characterized yet. If you look more broadly, for example, in seawater, we know that there are about 3 million viruses per milliliter in the deep sea, and about 1 × 10⁸ viruses per milliliter in coastal waters. So overall, people assume that there are about 1 × 10⁻30 viruses in the ocean overall. That's quite a lot of viruses as particles, right? Not virus families, but particles. And that's quite amazing. And if you're anything like me, you have no clue what 1 × 10⁻30 actually means. Here's an estimation. So that would roughly be the mass of about 75 million blue whales. That's still a large number that I can't process, but blue whales are quite big. I've seen one, and 75 million of those are quite a lot. So what we assume is that viruses are actually the most abundant biological entities on the planet. And this raises even more questions. If viruses are that big a part of the known world, why are they there? What are they doing there? Are they just a threat, or do they actually have a function? And did God actually potentially intend their existence? Joshua Moritz published a paper in 2020, and I think he's not the only one. I think we've seen lots of headlines about viruses being evil during the pandemic, but he very clearly states, I conclude that the nature and behavior of RNA viruses can be categorized as evil. He's careful with saying it can be categorized, and he limits it to RNA viruses, but it's quite interesting how he argues in saying that viruses actually can be described as evil. So here's his explanation. He says, many characteristics of viruses significantly correspond with how evil is characterized in the Bible, in the Jewish and Christian theological traditions. Viruses have their evolutionary origin in their departure from the way of life, that's his first point, and they subsist and thrive through an extreme form of predatory selfishness. Like evil and the demonic in the Bible, viruses are a form of intelligent non-life that seeks to distort information and truth in order to illegitimately enter in through a host's gate in order to steal and destroy health and life. So his three main arguments are that viruses origin in their departure from the way of life, so they've protruded from what was intended, normal way of life, they're predatory and selfish, and they illegitimately enter into host cells and destroy life. So that's why he claims they're evil. Please keep these points in mind. I hope we can address most of them today. But of course, the consequence of his argument is that would basically mean that viruses were not intended as original part of creation, and they're mainly a consequence of the fall. And before we dig back into viruses, let me just mention that, of course, I'm not an expert on the fall and the theologies behind the fall, and there's a lot of complexity around and beyond the Augustinian tradition that we know, meaning that there's a lot more than just evil through the acts of Adam and Eve as the first human beings that's then inherited through generations and generations. And if you're interested in the fall and the theology of the fall, here are some sources that you can dig into. On the Biologos website, there are some very good introductory articles before you have to even dig into specific theological arguments, and they summarize a lot. That's really helpful. If you're interested in what the fall actually means for the animal kingdom and the plants and how that fits into evolution, you can have a look at what Bethany Solerator publishes or Christopher Southgate. They discuss this from the perspective of suffering. And a very interesting book is Finding Ourselves After Darwin, because it's a compilation of articles from different theologians with different backgrounds and different thoughts on where evil actually comes from and how this fits with evolutionary theory. So please look into these things if you're interested in that, and we'll swap back to the topic of viruses for now. So coming back to viruses as a consequence of the fall, in the following hopefully 20 minutes or so, we'll look at the origin of viruses, whether or not they're predatory, selfish, and think a bit more about how they enter cells and cause disease. So viruses, are they actually selfish and are they parasites? Well, they're definitely parasites. So when you look at how viruses replicate, what makes them different to bacteria is that they do not have a cell membrane or their own metabolism, which means they lack the feature of self-reproduction outside a host. So imagine you have a jar of nutrients, you have one bacterium, you place that into that jar, and that bacterium will happily reproduce and reproduce. And by the end of the day, you'll have a lot of bacteria in that one jar. Whereas if you do the same with a virus, the viruses will sit at you and stare at you and don't do anything. So what a virus actually needs, it needs to get into a cell, because all it has and all it is a piece of information. And that piece of information basically tells the cell how to produce more virus particles. So viruses are extremely good at entering cells because they know how the different receptors on the cell surface look like. They can slot into them and the cell will happily open up for them, take them in. And inside the cell, the virus can interact with different pieces of machinery the cell usually uses for its own purposes. And these pieces of machinery will copy the genome of the virus and will produce more virus particles. So in that sense, yes, of course, we're dealing with a parasite. And interestingly, we're dealing with a non-living parasite, which is a very different theological discussion that we might come back to later on. So where do the viruses actually come from? Can we say that they are a departure from the way of life, as Joshua Moritz argues? So there are three different theories. Let me introduce them to you. So theory one is called the virus early hypothesis. And this basically means that in a world before any cellular existence, there was a pool of replicons. So basically RNA or DNA molecules that could replicate and copy themselves. And this was the basis for the existence of cells and what we now call virus particles. And these first virus-like entities increased in complexity and built what we now call cells. So in the very end, without these pools of replicons, there would neither be viruses nor cells. And potentially a virus was the prototype that was then transformed and increased in complexity and built a cell. So in that model, viruses are actually crucial for the existence of life. In the second model, this is called regression hypothesis, we start from what we call protocells that aren't quite yet cells, but one of these protocells somehow lost some features and got reduced in its features and became something that's now called a virus. And other cells didn't lose their features, and they are now the ones infected by these viruses. So there's a bit of a reductive evolutionary process imagined here. And the third hypothesis is called escaped gene hypothesis, where you imagine a modern cell, and for some reason, there's a genetic element that gets autonomous, leaves the cell, and becomes one of these replicating selfish genes that we now call virus. Right. So the interesting thing, I think, is that if we think about viruses as a consequence of fall, in most of these scenarios, viruses have been around since the beginning of life. Maybe the last one you can think of as potentially one that could be discussed with the fall. But in the very end, viruses have shaped life from the beginning. And that, of course, causes some theological issues. If you're more interested in how viruses have shaped life, here's an interesting secular book by Frank Ryan called Virolution. That's where I used the term from and stole it from him. I think that's quite a cool term. So yeah, read up on that if you're interested in that. We will think more about virolution in the next couple of slides. And of course, as you can imagine, the problem is if we think about virolution as a concept, and I think it's a concept that biology can show exists, then we're clashing with the thought that viruses are merely a consequence of the fall, because then that means that viruses have actually contributed to the development of beauty and to the development of what God declares as good. So how does virolution actually work? I've picked a few ideas for you and a few concepts. So one way viruses can actually lead to evolution is by, for example, adding pressure. And I think that's the most predatory element I have on these slides, because, of course, as you can imagine, adding pressure isn't anything a cell would experience as very nice. So in the very end, you have an arms race going on by a virus that tries to adjust to the cellular machinery and use it more effectively and more efficiently, and the cell trying to escape that. And that's the pressure the cell experiences. And of course, that pressure doesn't only apply to immune system. This pressure applies to each and every individual function a cell has. And that basically means that in 2016, when they tried to calculate how big that pressure actually was and how many changes were caused by viruses, this group say, we conservatively estimate that viruses have driven close to 30% of all adaptive amino acid changes in the part of the human proteome conserved within mammals. That's quite a large proportion, and you can imagine that different viruses, of course, have different pressures. So if you assume all the viruses that we've encountered during evolution, they've all had an impact, and who we are now and how our cells work is a product of that. So that's one way viruses lead to virolution. A second way is very simply by insertion. So there are certain virus families that, as a normal part of their replication cycle, use their genome and insert it into our genomes. And here's a whole list, because we can see this not only for humans, of course, but throughout the range of plant and animal kingdoms. In mammals, sheep, cats, fruit flies, bananas, yeast, ground squirrel. And the examples here in this list are the ones that we've characterized so far. there's a large proportion of genetic elements in our genomes that we don't know what they're doing, but that we can see must have originated from historic virus infections. And that's quite interesting. So when you look at what some of these now do, because some actually have functions, here's a very famous example from the mammalian system in humans and other mammals, is the syncytin. Syncytin, as you can see on the top panel on the right, was a glycoprotein on the cell surface, on the surface of a virus. And this glycoprotein actually helped the virion to fuse with the cell so that the virus particle could enter. This protein is now expressed because the gene is inserted in our genome, and our cells can express that, which basically means that in our cellular system, this glycoprotein can now be used for cell-cell fusion, leading to the formation of a syncytium. And the interesting bit is that this is placed at quite a crucial mammalian problem, namely how to keep an embryo in your uterus. This protein is helping the placental morphogenesis and is quite crucial during pregnancies. And if there's a lack of expression of this protein, this can actually lead to severe problems during pregnancy. So we're making use of what once was a virus gene for the purpose of our own reproduction. Here's a second example that's less famous, and I'm very sorry, this is a complicated slide, but what you can basically see is how human cells produce a vast amount of different antibodies. So you can see the ready-to-go antibody at the bottom, and when you imagine that we have so many pathogens that we need to build specific antibodies against, that means that we would actually need a lot more genes than we have. So an easy way to produce a variable region that can attack multiple different pathogens when needed is to then rearrange the genes that lead to this antibody depending on what we need. So this process is called recombination, and you can see that during the course of this recombination, we use these two dots called REC1 and REC2. These are proteins that also once belonged to a virus, and of course used their skill to reshuffle genes for the virus. But we are making use of this to produce the plethora of different antibodies that we now need to protect against infections. So we can make use of that as well. A third way where parts of genes that once belonged to viruses actually contribute to our complexity is more a thought. I think there's less research done on that yet. But you might know that just having a lot of genes doesn't mean complexity of an organism. Rice, for example, has a lot more genes than we have, but yet we're the more complex organism. At least that's what we assume. And so we assume that complexity is built by how we use these genes and how we regulate them. And viruses do have a lot of regulatory elements because they're very small, and they also have a small genome that needs to be regulated well. So one way we think that we can make use of viruses is the ones that have not only integrated the genes that lead to protein synthesis, but they have also integrated their regulatory elements. And so potentially when we have a stimulus that needs a response from multiple genes, we need, of course, a signal that tells all these genes that we want to respond with to be upregulated at the same time. And hopefully, and I think that's what this paper suggests, this is something that viruses are actually contributing to us, in that their regulatory elements can help us navigate complexity by up and down regulating a whole set of genes at the same time. So these are thoughts about how viruses lead to our complexity that we have nowadays. And so the question is, if we've seen this revolutionary aspect that already clashes with the thought that viruses are pure evil, are there any other examples? And so I call this category when viruses are not necessarily the bad guys. So let me explain this. We've looked at antagonistic viruses that make us sick to start with in this presentation. And I've just given some examples of symbiogenic examples where viruses have become part of who we are, of our biology and our rhythms of life. But research suggests that the majority of viruses around, out of all these millions and millions that make up this planet, that they actually don't do a lot. We would call them commensal. They're around, but they don't harm us. And then there's a group that we call mutualistic. So these are interactions where we and other animals or plants have with viruses, and there's an interaction that's beneficial. And let me give you some examples for those as well. And I assume, of course, the whole term selfish will fall with these. So I call this viruses and their superpowers because there are a few examples that I was quite excited about to find where viruses transfer a skill to the host that they infect. So for white clover plants, we see that they're suddenly less attractive to fungal nuts when they're infected with a white clover mosaic virus. Wild gourds are suddenly less attractive to beetles when infected with zucchini yellow mosaic virus. So that's quite helpful for the plants, I assume. Interestingly, when you look at rice, there's an example where when the rice is infected with brown mosaic virus, it can tolerate drought a lot more. And you can see this in the photo on the right-hand side, but you have a poor plant that looks a bit like the plants that I usually deal with in my living room because I forget to water them, and one on the right. And the main difference is that the one on the right has been infected with the mosaic virus. So these are examples where it's actually beneficial to be infected with the virus for the plants. But there's a lot more to see. So viruses also have a global impact that's not just affecting one individual host. And I think that's quite logical. So imagine you have one infected host. This will cause a chain of events because, of course, that host lives as part of a whole population. And if one host is unwell, changes behavior, changes birth and death rates, this population is affected. And this will go all the way from top to down, where predator-prey competitions are suddenly changed and whole ecosystems shift in their behavior. There's an interesting example from the late 19th century where there was a rinderpest in Central Africa. And so there was a lot of wildebeest dying from that rinderpest. And with less wildebeest around, there was less grazing pressure on the environment, which basically meant that wildfires could spread much faster through the area, leading to a change in the ecosystem from a forestry area to grassland area. Then a vaccine was introduced, the wildebeest population recovered, grazing pressure was back on, and the whole ecosystem converted back to a forestry area. And you can see how one individual virus, if it spreads from one individual, then within a population actually changes not just one population, but whole ecosystems. And if you think about how different ecosystems are connected, this will even further increase the radius that one virus has an impact on. Here's another example that I quite like. So when you look at the ecosystem ocean, for example, we all know that there are lots of animals living in the ocean, and there are plants and plankton and whatnot. And the interesting thing is, how do you keep the diversity up? If one species suddenly takes over, it will basically mean that other species have to move away and have less nutrients available. And so viruses are quite a crucial part to keep the diversity within not only the ecosystem ocean, but within other ecosystems. In the ocean, what's interesting, because we can actually see this, is how viruses help to make nutrients available, because you can imagine that, of course, most of these animals and plants live in the top layers of the ocean. It means if one of those die, they would sink to much lower areas of the ocean, and these nutrients would disappear for millions and millions of years. With viruses that actually lyse the cells in the upper surface areas, that means that nutrients will stay in the surface areas of the ocean and can be taken up again by other animals, which I think is quite a neat system to keep and recycle nutrients that are available. There's also some research on photosynthesis. For example, there are certain algae and bacteria that are quite responsible for our oxygen production. About half of the world's oxygen is produced in the oceans, and there's good evidence that viruses actually shaped this process and delivered and contributed genes that help this process of photosynthesis as well. So there's just some examples of how viruses actually have quite a global impact, and if they weren't around, we would feel the consequences. So one thought from all of this is that we usually think quite subjectively about viruses. We see a friend infected, we suffer from infections ourselves, but we rarely think about how we are part of bigger ecosystems and how we are connected with these ecosystems and how viruses spread within ecosystems. I think there are two examples where we sometimes remember that. So we've seen it for SARS, CoV, let's call it 1 in 2003, where we first realized that, of course, there's an origin of the virus in bats, and then there's intermediate hosts, and when they become infected, they bring it closer to us, and then we are one of these end hosts. And the same with MERS and the camel, and now SARS-CoV-2. We're not quite sure what the intermediate host was. And I think another virus that we encounter quite frequently, which is the avian influenza virus, here we are more or less aware that, of course, we are just one end host of influenza viruses. There's a lot more going on within the avian influenza field. There's sometimes viruses in pigs. We've seen the swine flu in the last 2 decades. And we are just one of these many players. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind. Because I think one of the issues we have with viruses, and I think that's quite symptomatic for how we think about natural evil, is that we have a very anthropocentric perspective on natural evil. And I'm not going too much into detail. I think we can discuss this potentially later. Is when we think about natural evil, I think it's different to, or it should be different to how we think about moral evil. I think moral evil, there is an objective standard of what good and evil is. Whereas I think with natural evil, it depends on who you are, which part of the ecosystem you belong to, if you experience something as evil or not. And a last category of our subjective experience is, as you hopefully know, how we feel during a disease. And you might already laugh about other people when they suffer more obviously than you would from the same virus. But of course, we have differences in how symptoms develop. And what's even more striking is that, of course, we all have flu-like symptoms, more or less, in between our human population. But the striking thing is that there are some animals like bats that don't have any symptoms from the same virus. So why is that? One reason is that many of these symptoms, from headaches, fever, tiredness, sore throat, they're actually caused by our immune system. And in bats, they have a lot of adaptations that make their immune system less likely to cause inflammatory signaling. So they have dampened TNF signaling, STING signaling, NLRP3 signaling in comparison to us, if you know what that means. If not, ignore that. The basic idea behind this is, if you, as an immune system, fight an infection, you want to clear a pathogen. But of course, if the more you clear the pathogen, the more you increase the risk of tissue damage. That's the pro-inflammatory response. You produce a lot of inflammatory things to get rid of the pathogens. And you need to balance that to also protect your tissue from damage. But that, of course, increases the risk of pathogen survival. And you do this by anti-inflammatory responses. And so we need to keep this in a balance to make us survive. But that sometimes means that we feel the symptoms of the immune system. And there's also a sex difference. So we've seen that, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic, males were affected much stronger from disease development than females. And that can be traced back to certain features of the immune system, from virus entry to how viruses actually sense by our immune system, to innate immune responses and adaptive immune responses. They're just different between the genders. And that means that for certain diseases or for certain viruses, there is a difference even within the human population of how we experience the virus and how we suffer from the virus. And that also means that, of course, we can't fully blame the virus for what it causes. It's also how we react to the virus. I think I've elaborated a bit more in my paper, A Virocentric Perspective on Evil. So if you're interested in that, you can read that. I think, the point I want to make is that not necessarily are viruses the bad guys. I think there's a lot more going on and a lot more complexity around that. Right. So we're almost at the end of the talk. What do we now think? Why are there viruses in God's creation? And I think the question is that we need to ask is, why do we actually ask the question? And I think there's certain different reasons why we ask the question. So some people ask the question because, of course, we want to know an answer to suffering. We experience suffering, and that's quite a frustrating experience, and that needs an answer. We sometimes want an answer to the question about God's existence. Can God exist in a world that includes suffering, that includes viruses? Or about his character? What do we think God is like if that's the world we live in, if viruses are a part of that? And I think another question we want to answer is, so what's directing this? What's the direction of action for us now? Having seen viruses, what's our responsibility? And what does this mean for us as human beings as we're part of this creation? So I think there are some clear biological challenges, and I think the pandemic over the last 3 years have shown us that there's a lot more to viruses than just its biological factors. So you can study a virus, you can study its virulence and its infectivity and its drug resistance and the cultural characteristics, the genetics of a virus, but this is only one player in the whole transmission cycle. There are environmental factors and there are human, social, and behavioral factors, which means that, of course, how we interact with the virus, how we react to the virus, will have an impact on transmission. Who we are has an impact. Our immunity, age, health status will determine susceptibility. And then there are environmental factors that we can't really control. There's humidity, there's temperature, global warming will come into play now. So there's loads going on that we can't fully blame only on the virus or only on us, but there's a combination of different factors involved. And of course, that means the main biological challenge for the next couple of years is thinking more in a One Health approach, where we need to keep an eye on all these factors. And from the human perspective, of course, we have the issue that we're living very close together. There will be changes in climate and land use. We travel a lot and trade globally. So all of these factors come into play, and we need to keep an eye out for them. But for us as Christians, there are also theological challenges when we look at this. So I think one of the challenges is acknowledging who we are. And I think viruses are a really good tool to understand more deeply who God created us to be. We are part of all of these ecosystems. We are part of the evolutionary process. And our identity is rooted within the whole of creation. So there needs to be thinking about how we define who we are, and we need to think about the origin of life as well. And viruses are a part of all of this. And the counterpart to this, and I think that's quite an interesting theological challenge, because the first point makes us humble. We are not above, but we are part of creation. But God has still called us out to have responsibility stewarding these ecosystems. And that means we are still different, and we need to have an eye out for these biological and theological challenges, because we have the capacity to think these things through. And so, as our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man would suggest, with great power comes great responsibility, not only in our actions, but also in our theology. And just a few more thoughts. I've already mentioned this. I think we have a very anthropocentric definition of natural evil, and I think we need to rethink what natural evil actually is, and we need to think more broadly about these topics. And I think what we started to think about will have an effect on how we think about the reality of suffering, how we judge suffering, and how we can then deal with God's character in this. And I've only shortly mentioned that viruses are described as non-living things. And I think this makes it very interesting because, of course, our definition of life usually comes from biology, and we declare viruses non-living and everything else is living, and there's a line. But the interesting thing theologically is how do we define life theologically? Because the biology isn't as clear as you would think. So there's a type of virus which we call giant viruses, and they're much more similar to bacteria, but not about quite yet bacteria. And so the line has become a gray zone in biology. And so the question is, does that actually mean that our theology needs to define life, and we can only look at biology through the lens of theology? So these are my questions I want to raise in a world that has viruses. As already advertised, this is my book. So if you're a German speaker and you're interested, you can read up about this in the book. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. And if you have questions, please pop them in the chat. And I'm looking forward to the discussion now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam. That was a very interesting lecture. And as you've mentioned, there's no time for questions. You can put these in the chat if you're watching from YouTube. But I would like to start with a comment in the first place, because the one thing that I take away from your lecture is how incredibly important, how essential it is for Christian theology and philosophy to take proper account of the information that is provided to us by science. If we take a shallow look on science, we might draw the wrong philosophical or theological conclusions. And so that was for me a very important point. I'm going to look at the comments now, and a couple of comments coming in. So here is a question. I wonder if the benefits of viruses could be more to do with the fact that in all things, God works for the good of things who know him and are called according to his purpose. Would you be able to comment on this?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because of course we don't know a world without viruses, and we don't know a world without God, I would claim. So the question is, it's a bit like a chicken and egg discussion, right? From an evolutionary point, I don't think there's a time without viruses. So I think the point I wanted to make is that viruses have been around ever since we define life, but of course from a biological perspective. So I don't think we can claim that, there was this cutoff of a fall, and then a virus as an evil thing came in, and then God made something good out of it. I think it was always there both ways. So there were always viruses, and there was always God's goodness. And I think the tricky bit with that is that viruses still cause suffering. So for whatever reason, if we claim that, of course, the good coming through God who can make good out of all things, then the question is, why doesn't he make good out of all the things? So I feel there's this balance we need to keep in mind, especially from, I think, a counseling perspective and how we talk to people about these things. And I think that's very important to me, because these very flat answers, they'll cause more suffering. And I truly believe that God can make good things out of bad things. The question is, are viruses necessarily and intrinsically bad? I would say probably not, but they can cause bad things. And within these bad things, I truly believe that God can make good out of that bad, but not necessarily has to. So we have to live with the tension that he doesn't always make good things out of bad things. And that's not unique to viruses. So I think, yeah, I know there's this balance, and we need to keep the balance right. And yeah, it's hard to do that. But thank you very much. I think that's quite an important comment.
I have got another question here. I think is related to this. Do you think that natural evil, including illness and physical suffering, is built into the creation, regardless of human sin or theology of the fall?
Yeah. So I'm still thinking about this, because I would prefer to live in a world where there was no suffering built in from the start. But then I look at the world biologically, and I see volcanoes and tectonic plates, and I see viruses, and I see a process that caused the existence of so much beauty and so many nice things, and it makes me wonder how a world that needs, or like if I believe in a world where God wants room to development, does that mean that this caused the necessity for things to have their own dynamics? And if things have their own dynamics, does that necessarily include suffering? And there's several thought experiments by philosophers and theologians, and I think they all fall short, because we can't imagine a scenario in which a free development of things can be led through the process without the freedom to behavioral problems leading to moral evil and physical evil and whatnot. But also, like, if you think of things that have less consciousness, I mean, a virus doesn't make conscious decisions. As a human being, of course, I need freedom, and or if I want freedom, that means I can make bad decisions. But a virus doesn't make decisions. So is that an intrinsic property of having an open process with room to develop? Did God want a world that could openly develop into multiple options, and he just watched in awe of how it would develop? Did he lead the process? And does that make he takes into account that there's bad stuff happening? And I think theologically, I'm probably more prone to say I think that there's probably more like an open world with open options that he created, and that sadly includes suffering. I prefer to live in a non-suffering world, but we are promised that one day we'll reach that point in eternity, so there's hope for us there. But I find it hard to imagine a world without suffering that has the same amount of freedom to develop.
Here also, again, a related question to this topic is here. Romans 8:21 suggests creation needs to be set free from corruption. What does that mean for virus in the new heavens and earth?
I love that question because even I think it was my transfer of status where we discussed this during my DPhil, and I'm not sure. I'm actually not sure what happens to viruses after that. Maybe we will only keep the commensal one, but also I can't even picture eternity, because at that point I feel like developments might stop. Are we at an end point of evolution at that point? And are we just, happily ever after with the state we've reached? What does that even mean? Or is physicality less of an issue? Although there will be a physical world, is there less focus on a physical world? And if viruses don't even have a conscience, are they part of life? Are they not part of life? I'm not sure how God views viruses and what that means for eternity. So that's a very good question, and I think there's lots of room to speculate. But yeah, it's hard to answer given the limited information we have from Revelations and other books that talk about eternity.
Yeah, if I may do so, I would like to jump into this with a question that I had actually before I listened to your lecture. And I find myself wondering, I mean, as Christians, we're talking about evolution as a God, a process that in some form or another is guided by God. So we talk about theistic evolution. And I find myself wondering, is that not quite, does that do justice in the way things are working? I find myself wondering whether we should rather say that evolvability is God's gift to the universe, that God has given freedom of the universe to self-develop, and that also in evolution that are things that are semi-autonomous in a sense, and that also leads to freedom. And is it that also so that in that context that somehow or another the evolutionary process has become corrupted, and that indeed evolution is, theologically speaking, in need of redemption?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not an evolutionary biologist, so by all means, please ask someone who knows more about that. I think from a personal perspective, just looking at biology, I can imagine both things. I can imagine a God, or I think one of the issues is that we think in this very linear time scale, but I know God doesn't, and that makes it really hard because we want to see. Or we want to know if this linear process of evolution, was that strictly guided? Was that slightly less guided? Was God just watching, within these three extremes? But in the very end, it's probably both, because God's not limited by time. He's not limited by our linearity of time. And that makes it really hard to, or at least like my brain is like not coping very well with that thought that if he is not limited by time, then he will have done both, right? It's a bit like Schrödinger's cat. He will probably have guided some things. He will probably have given a lot of freedom, and he probably has watched and has already known the outcome at all at the same time. And that baffles me because I don't know what to do with that, because I'm so limited to my time frame. I think that's one of the thoughts I have. Other than that, I really don't know, because I find it, from what I see biblically, also biblical characters, they live with this tension of knowing that sometimes God prompts things to do, or at least they interpret God's reaction to things as he's prompting things to happen. He's doing miracles, he's doing things, he's actively involved. But at other times, they don't know what happens. They watch his silence, they watch a lot of room that doesn't live with him doing stuff, And for some of the bad things in the Old Testament or New Testament, we don't even hear a word from God that he's judging this. Whereas for others, he's very clear. So there's this constant tension of, is he still around? Yes, he is, because we once in a while see him do stuff. But at which points does he choose to interact? And I think that's none of our business, sadly, and sometimes frustratingly in our own personal life. And I assume that I can transfer that back to biology, that what I experience in my spiritual life is probably also true for evolution, that I don't know when he was involved. And I also don't understand why at points and not at others. So I think that's quite a tricky thing.
I have here another question, which is a fairly lengthy question, and I think it's a difficult one as well, and a very good one. So I'll read it out. Notably, God's creation is described as Genesis as good or very good, but not perfect, unlike the Passover lamb, which was described as without blemish. So how should theologians respond to different hypotheses of ultimate viral origins, mindful both of the viral host coevolution and uncertainties due to their relatively rapid viral evolutionary rates?
Yeah, I think we can only respond to this honestly, saying first of all, we don't know about the virus origin other than that we have hypotheses. We can't prove any of them. And I think there's, from just watching viruses in life now, there's probably enough evidence for all three of them, and there's probably no evidence that proves one is the only true one. And potentially it's all three that are true at the same time. So we might have had these replicative elements to start with, that was the basis of viruses that then developed into cells. But there's no guarantee that, these then didn't become less evolved and suddenly moved back into viral stage, or that at some point a genetic element got, selfish and corrupted and moved out of this. So I think with all of these questions, I think I prefer to stay humble and say I honestly don't know, because I can't know. I can speculate and I can think about these things, and I think it's important to think about these things. But in the very end, from a biological perspective, I can't prove any of these theories, and I really shouldn't. And because I think that's leaving the place of where we are. We can only do science in the now. We can't look back. We can speculate back based on predictions, but these are based on current experiences. So as a biologist, I think we need to stay humble and say we don't know. And I think as a theologian, it's probably similar, because we're living in this tension of living in a physical world, but knowing that there's a lot more going on in the spiritual world, and these things interact. And as biologists, we only measure things happening. But of course, we need to assume that there's no spiritual involvement, because otherwise that would totally mess with our experiments. We can only draw conclusions on the things we measure, and we need to assume that they're purely independent of all other influences. And of course, that's a lie, and we know that. But we have to do that because that's the definition of how we do natural sciences. And as a theologian, it's the other way around. We know about all of these things, but we can't necessarily assume that all the things that we see are purely caused by spiritual things. There's a physical world, and we need to interact with that, because I'm pretty sure there will be autonomous space for that physical world, because God created us with free will and all sorts of things. So I think the main wisdom is knowing your limitations of what you can know theologically, and knowing your limitations of what you can know biologically. And I think then we reach a point where it's an interesting discussion where these things hopefully slightly slot into each other, but we can't solve the tension. And I think we need to stay humble with that.
I'd like to ask another question. I've been trying to read a few books related to ecology and our care for the environment, and some of the suggestions that I see being voiced, this is something that I don't have a great deal of knowledge about, but the suggestions that I see is that the spread of viruses in human populations might be affected by our lack of care for the environment. And for instance, that certain infections from the animal world might go into human populations more easily if we don't have areas where nature continues undisturbed. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think in the last decade or two, we've seen that also biologists have picked up on that with the One Health movement that I mentioned, because there are certain things, right? We don't look well after the environment in the first place, which means we have diversity of certain species going down, and if you have less diversity, that also fosters the ability of a virus to specifically adapt to one species. And of course, if it's perfectly adapted, then the proximity of that species to us also helps to jump. So by not taking care of diversity, we already make a mistake. And then of course with deforestation, with driving animals out of their natural habitats, because our cities are getting bigger and bigger, and we need the place to build factories and do agriculture and whatnot. We're coming physically closer, and of course they are now part of our cities, and you can basically see lots of animals meander around towns during nighttime, because they pick our food and live with us now. We're not doing well with animal husbandry in the first place, because we have so many mouths to feed. We're not taking good care of them in the way we do that. Meat production chains. We've seen the animal markets in China and lots of other places. I mean, Ebola usually spreads because someone goes into the forest and takes wild meat. And if you pick an infected animal, then that easily spreads through your town and village. And because you start traveling, next village after that, next country, and so it's a chain of events. And I think the whole One Health movement is one that tries to raise awareness of how we deal with ecosystems, how we treat forests, how we treat ecosystems where animals live, how we treat their diversity. And so this is a really good point. And I think that there we have lots of responsibilities, because we are thinking beings, and God clearly tells us to take care of the environment. And I think biology gives us good tools to understand the dynamics and how different changes affect things. And when we think about climate change, I mean, for like 20, 30 years, climate activists and climate scientists say, you need to be aware, it's getting worse, you need to do something. And are we doing something? No, we're not. And what actually currently happens is that, of course, with changing climates, also animal migrate and plant diversity changes in different places. And this has the same effect. So we have mosquitoes that are spreading and that now living in countries that were usually too cold for them. And of course, these mosquitoes work as a vector, so they're bringing diseases with them. And so we will be confronted with viruses that we've never seen before. So all of these things interact, and taking care of the environment would be quite important when we want to control virus spread or other infectious diseases in the long run.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of questions here. So other things in creation, like earthquakes and volcanoes, cause suffering, but are necessary for the earth to work. Are viruses similar to this, do you think?
I want to say yes, but with the remark that, of course, yes, for the world we know. I can't, if we didn't have viruses, I'm not sure if we would have living things, because I'm not sure how much they were actually involved in the existence or in cellular organisms to develop. But if that was manageable without viruses, I still think the world would have developed quite differently. So I think from our current perspective, I would clearly say yes, the world that we currently live in and the way it looks, the way it works, the way different things function, I think this is only happening because there are viruses and earthquakes because of volcanoes and all these things. Of course, if we exclude all of that, I can't tell you there wouldn't be a world. There would probably still be a world, but who knows how it would look like. So I think from a very subjective perspective, and the fact that I like the current world, I'm quite happy that there are viruses, and I think they were necessary to get us here.
Here's another question. We are simply not in a position to judge with any sort of confidence the probability of God having morally sufficient reasons for permitting suffering to occur. Would you agree with this or not?
Are we in a position to judge with confidence that God has moral reasons for it? I mean, we do have a Bible, right? I mean, all the moral conclusions we can draw about God's morality and all the judgment is coming from the Bible, right? And we see that there is suffering, and we see that not in all instances does God judge the suffering. So the question is why? And in that case, I can only assume that he has a reason for it. But that basically gets us to the question about God's character. And I think you can come from two directions, right? You can look at the world, see suffering, and judge God's character and say, well, that means he has a bad character. Or you can assume that what the Bible tells us is the truth, that he was part of suffering, he came into a suffering world, he suffered himself, which means that he, for himself, agrees to that world, but also comes up with a solution of how to restore a relationship in that world. And I think these things we can know about him, but that presumes, or in that case, we have to presume that the Bible actually tells us the truth about God's character. And I think from that perspective and that angle, then we can judge the world. So it depends a bit on where you start. Do you start judging God's character depending on what you see, or do you start with God's character and then think about what that means for what you see? And I think both are legitimate, because of course I can't prove God to you, and no one can, and both approaches are legitimate. And I think we just need to be aware of where we're coming from. And I'm referring back to Bethany Solerator. She has written a different book that I haven't shown about the question of theodicy, and it's a really interesting book because it's basically a pick your own theodicy book. So you can get awareness of what your presumptions on different topics are, and then you choose. I believe that God has a good character, and then you continue to read on page 200 something, and oh no, I'm not quite sure about his character, and so you continue reading on page 100 something, and so it guides you through the different things and beliefs that are in your background when you think about suffering in a certain way, and it just shows you that you can actually pick a different perspective, and depending on your choice, you make a different conclusions about God or suffering. So I recommend that book as well. It's really fun, and just shows that there are different ways to approach this.
Okay, I'm just looking at the comments that are coming in, and I don't see any further questions. So if there are no further questions, then I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Miriam Schilling for delivering a truly excellent lecture on a very relevant topic. And we want to thank all of you who've joined this live stream, and also those who listen to this lecture at a future date. I also want to thank Dr. Garrett Dalzell, who has been on standby in the case of internet problems, and especially to Steph Bevan in Durham. Steph is currently the school's development officer with God in the Big Bang. She was previously the development officer for Christians in Science, and she has controlled the live stream to YouTube that you've been watching tonight. Goodbye and God bless, and please note the URL in the chat where you can find more information on the Walton Lectures.
Thank you very much.